October 1942, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. The evening sun cast long shadows across the oil-stained concrete of dry dock number 1. Steam hissed from welding torches as shifts of workers moved through the dusk like schools of fish, their acetylene flames creating constellations of blue-white light against the hull of USS Enterprise. The carrier had limped into port 72 hours earlier, her flight deck cratered, her forward elevator jammed. 3 bomb hits that should have sent her to the bottom now laid bare under the unforgiving Hawaiian sky. Japanese intelligence estimated 6 months for repairs. American welders gave her 3 weeks. The air smelled of hot metal and salt spray, of coffee kept too long on burners, and the acrid bite of electrical work. Around the clock, the shipyard hummed with an industrial symphony that never paused, never questioned, never doubted. Somewhere in the South Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto's staff studied reconnaissance photographs and marked another American carrier off their charts, calculating the diminishing American fleet with the precision of men who believed mathematics would win the war. They were counting hulls. They should have been counting hours. This was the calculus. They had never learned to measure the speed at which democracy could repair what empire had broken. Architects of Japan's Pacific strategy had built their war plan on a foundation of careful numerical analysis. They had counted American battleships at anchor in December 1941 and calculated that the destruction of those 8 vessels would grant them 18 months of operational freedom. They had measured the distance from Tokyo to Washington and concluded that American will would fracture before American industry could mobilize. They had studied the construction times of warships in peacetime and projected those schedules onto a nation at war. Every calculation was precise. Every assumption was wrong. What the Japanese naval general staff failed to comprehend was not American. Industrial capacity, they knew the United States could build ships, but the transformation that occurs when democracy faces existential threat. They had mistaken American reluctance for weakness, American debate for indecision, American abundance for softness. They had assumed that a nation which argued so loudly in peacetime would fragment under the pressure of war. Instead, they discovered that argument was not division, but the forge in which American resolve was tempered. The officers of the combined fleet had expected to face an enemy that would need to pause, to rebuild, to reorganize according to the methodical peacetime schedules they themselves followed. Japanese shipyards operated with the rhythms of tradition, where proper procedure and established hierarchy determined the pace of work. A damaged carrier required months of assessment, formal approval through multiple layers of command, allocation of resources through bureaucratic channels that respected rank and seniority above all else. This was not inefficiency. It was civilization, order, the proper way that great powers had always made war. But the Americans had brought to naval warfare the same industrial pragmatism they had applied to automobiles and radios and refrigerators. They had brought assembly lines and shift work and the radical notion that any man trained in a skill was as valuable as any other when the work needed doing. They had brought a disregard for impossible and an impatience with can't that would have seemed like chaos to officers trained in the rigid hierarchies of Bushido. USS Yorktown had proven this in a way that should have served as warning. Damaged at Coral Sea in May 1942, the carrier had absorbed a bomb hit that penetrated her flight deck and exploded 4 decks down, killing and wounding dozens, starting fires that burned through compartments and threatened magazines. Japanese pilots reported her sinking. Japanese intelligence marked her as out of action for months. Japanese war planners calculated the coming battle at Midway with confidence that only 2 American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, could possibly respond in time. Yorktown arrived at Pearl Harbor on May 27th. Her crew could see sky through holes in her deck. Fuel oil leaked from ruptured tanks. Her list was visible from shore. Estimators calculated 90 days of repair work. a timeline that would have been aggressive in any peacetime yard. Admiral Nimitz gave them 3 days. 1,400 workers swarmed the carrier before her lines were fully secured. They worked through day and night, through shift changes marked only by the rotation of fresh crews, through a 72-hour window that seemed designed to prove that American industry measured time differently than the rest of the world. Welders repaired hull plates while electricians rewired systems 10 feet away. Carpenters replaced shattered timbers as steel workers cut away twisted metal overhead. There was no elegance to it, no ceremony, no respect for the proper order of tasks. There was only forward momentum, the grinding inevitability of thousands of skilled hands refusing to acknowledge that anything was impossible if you simply kept working. Yorktown sortied on May 30th. She reached Point Luck, 200 miles northeast of Midway, on June 4th. When Japanese dive bombers found her that morning, they attacked what they believed was a different carrier, because Yorktown was supposed to be in Pearl Harbor for the next 3 months. The ships they had damaged, they discovered, did not stay damaged. The Americans had somehow found a way to compress time itself. This was the pattern that would haunt Japanese war planning for the next 3 years. The persistent, impossible resurrection of vessels that should have been written off. Enterprise, Saratoga, Franklin, each returned from damage that would have permanently sidelined any ship in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Each time, Japanese intelligence officers revised their estimates downward, trying to account for repair speeds that violated everything they understood about naval logistics. Each time, they were still too conservative. The secret was not superior technology or some revolutionary new technique in damage control. The secret was abundance married to urgency, industrial capacity welded to democratic determination. American shipyards had space, materials, workers, and, most crucially, the authority to ignore peacetime procedures in favor of wartime results. A yard supervisor could authorize modifications without routing requests through naval bureaucracy. A shift foreman could order materials knowing they would arrive because the entire continental United States was feeding the pipeline. A welder could work 12-hour shifts knowing that hot food, strong coffee, and a place to sleep would be waiting, because the civilian infrastructure that supported the military effort was itself a weapon of war. 34 Japanese officers studying reconnaissance. Photographs in headquarters bunkers across the Pacific were trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. Within their framework of understanding, they saw the same carriers appearing again and again in battle, when their own records indicated those ships should be inoperative. They increased their estimates of American repair capacity. They revised their intelligence on shipyard capabilities. They hypothesized about secret facilities and revolutionary new technologies. They never quite grasped that they were not facing technology, but philosophy. The fundamental American belief that any problem could be solved if enough people worked hard enough, fast enough, with enough resources and enough freedom to ignore anyone who said it couldn't be done. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, later wrote of his growing unease as the war progressed. "We would receive confirmed reports of damage to American carriers," he recalled in his post-war interrogations. "We would study the photographs, calculate the repairs needed, and mark these ships off our order of battle. Then, in a matter of weeks, we would encounter them again in combat. It was as if we were fighting ghosts, ships that should not exist, appearing in battles where they could not possibly be." What Fuchida and his fellow officers were encountering was the industrial expression of democratic urgency. In Japan, decisions flowed downward through established chains of command. Resources were allocated according to strategic priorities, determined at the highest levels. Work proceeded according to schedules that balanced military necessity against industrial capacity and social harmony. This was how great powers had always organized their war efforts, with planning, with hierarchy, with respect for proper procedure. America in 1942 operated differently. Decisions about how to repair a carrier were made by the men actually doing the repairs, supervisors who could see the damage and knew their workers and understood what could be accomplished if no one worried. Too much about doing things the way they had always been done. Resources flowed to wherever the need was greatest, with a fluidity that would have seemed anarchic to Japanese observers, but which reflected the American talent for organized chaos. Workers put in hours that would have violated every peacetime. Labor law because they knew why the work mattered and believed their individual effort could change the outcome. The recurring symbol of this transformation was the work light, those temporary electrical fixtures that turned night into day across the shipyards. Japanese facilities observed blackout procedures, worked during daylight hours, maintained schedules that respected the natural rhythms of human endurance. American yards blazed with artificial light 24 hours a day, visible from miles away, a declaration that darkness itself would not slow the work. Those lights represented more than just willingness to work through the night. They symbolized a nation that had decided speed mattered more than caution, results more than procedure, winning more than anything else. USS Enterprise became the embodiment of this philosophy. She was hit repeatedly by bombs at Eastern Solomons in August 1942, by kamikaze at Santa Cruz in October, by more bombs and another kamikaze at Philippine Sea in 1944. Each time, she withdrew from battle damaged. Each time, repair estimates suggested months of work. Each time, she returned in weeks, her wounds patched, her systems functional enough, her crew ready to fight. She was not always restored to perfect condition. Some repairs were crude. Some systems remained compromised. Some damage was simply worked around rather than properly fixed. But she was operational, and in a war of attrition, operational was all that mattered. Japanese carriers, by contrast, did not bounce back. Shokaku, damaged at Coral Sea, required months of repair. Zuikaku lost most of her air group in the same battle and needed more months to train replacements. Junyo, torpedoed in November 1943, never returned to frontline service. The pattern was consistent. Japanese vessels that suffered significant damage tended to leave the war permanently. American vessels that suffered similar damage tended to be back in weeks. The arithmetic was devastating. Each time a Japanese carrier went down, the Imperial Navy became weaker. Each time an American carrier was damaged, she returned stronger, because the repairs often included upgrades, new equipment, lessons learned from the damage she had taken. The Americans were iterating, improving, adapting with a speed that reflected their industrial culture. They were treating carriers the way Detroit treated car models, as platforms to be refined, updated, made better with each production cycle. By 1944, the disparity had become almost surreal. The Japanese Navy had essentially ceased to exist as an effective carrier force after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed over 400 Japanese aircraft in what pilots would mockingly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The few Japanese carriers that remained were reduced to decoys, their flight decks empty, their purpose merely to draw American attention from more valuable targets. Meanwhile, the American fleet had swelled to more than 100 carriers. Fleet, carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers, each one a floating airfield, each one capable of projecting power across hundreds of miles. The Japanese officers who survived the war would speak in their interrogations of a slow dawning horror as they realized what they faced. "We had thought we understood American industrial power," one staff officer admitted. "We had seen the statistics on steel production, automobile manufacturing, electrical generation. But we had thought these were peacetime measures, and that war would slow them down. force them to choose priorities, limit their flexibility. We did not understand that war would accelerate everything. They became faster, more efficient, more capable the longer the war continued. We became weaker. This was not what we had planned for. What they had planned for was a war that followed historical patterns, where nations fought until exhaustion forced negotiation. They had planned for battles that would sap American will, for distances that would frustrate American logistics, for time that would favor the defender. They had studied wars of attrition and believed that Japan's warrior spirit would outlast American materialism. Every assumption rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of what happens when a democracy decides it must win. The shipyard at Pearl Harbor became, in microcosm, a demonstration of this transformation. Before the war, it had been a substantial facility, but one that operated on peacetime schedules, with peacetime priorities, with the comfortable assumption that work would proceed at the pace that work had always proceeded. After December 7th, 1941, it became something else entirely. A vast organism that consumed damaged ships and produced operational ones, that worked without pause, that measured success in hours rather than months. The workers who made this possible were themselves a uniquely American phenomenon. They were old shipwrights who had built vessels for 3 decades alongside 18-year-olds trained in crash courses that turned farmers and shopkeepers into welders in a matter of weeks. They were men who had been unemployed during the Depression, now working overtime for wages that seemed miraculous. They were women who had never expected to hold industrial jobs, now operating cranes and cutting torches and rivet guns. They were a cross-section of American society united by the understanding that their work directly determined whether sailors lived or died, whether battles were won or lost, whether democracy survived or fell. This was the weapon that Admiral Yamamoto had failed to account for in his careful calculations. He had counted hulls and aircraft and naval guns. He had measured distances and fuel capacities and operational ranges. He had analyzed American political divisions and concluded that a democracy could not sustain will over years of conflict. He had not counted the willingness of workers to put in 70-hour weeks because they knew it mattered. He had not measured the flexibility of a system that could ignore its own regulations when those regulations slowed victory. He had not understood that abundance was not just having more resources, but the social organization to deploy those resources wherever they were needed, whenever they were needed, as fast as they were needed. The welders working on Enterprise in October 1942 were not thinking about grand strategy or democratic theory. They were thinking about the next seam, the next plate, the next repair that would get this ship back to sea. But in aggregate, across thousands of workers and dozens of ships, their individual efforts created a strategic effect that no Japanese planner had anticipated: the effective immortality of the American carrier fleet. Ships could be damaged, but not permanently sidelined. Hulls could be hit, but would return. The Americans had created a fleet that could absorb damage, repair itself, and return to battle faster than the Japanese could inflict new damage. A sustainable cycle that meant every battle would gradually shift the balance further toward the growing American armada. By war's end, the speed of American repairs had become legendary even among former enemies. Japanese naval officers, imprisoned and awaiting trial or repatriation, would ask their American guards about the shipyards, seeking to understand what they had faced. Some refused to believe the timelines until shown the maintenance logs, the repair schedules, the documentary evidence of work that had seemed impossible. Others simply nodded, recognizing at last what they had been fighting. Not just a nation with more resources, but a society that had learned to deploy those resources with a speed and flexibility that industrial autocracy could never match. The lesson was broader than naval logistics. What the Americans had demonstrated in their shipyards was the advantage of systems that pushed decision-making downward. that trusted skilled workers to solve problems, that measured success by results rather than adherence to procedure. This was democracy applied to industrial production, the notion that freedom and flexibility produced better outcomes than rigid hierarchy. That argument and debate in peacetime created resilience and adaptation in war. That societies which seemed chaotic and undisciplined could mobilize with a totality that authoritarian states could only envy. The worklights still burned at Pearl Harbor on August 15, 1945, when word came through that Japan had accepted surrender terms. Ships still lined the dry docks, though now they were there for routine maintenance rather than battle damage repair. The workers who had spent 4 years proving that impossible was just a word that meant you had to work harder, packed their tools, collected their final paychecks, and dispersed back into American society. Most would never fully articulate what they had accomplished. They had welded seams and repaired hulls and kept ships operational. In doing so, they had won a war. 60 years later, researchers examining Japanese naval records would find notation after notation beside American carrier names. Status uncertain. Previously reported damaged. Confirm operational status before engagement. These cautionary notes represented a kind of defeat that went deeper than battles lost or ships sunk. They represented the moment when Japanese planners realized they were facing an enemy that did not follow the rules they understood, an industrial system that operated at speeds they could not match, a democracy that had proven more resilient, more flexible, and more ruthlessly efficient than any authoritarian alternative. The carriers themselves became monuments to this truth. Enterprise, the most decorated ship in American naval history, survived the war despite being hit repeatedly. Because each time she was hit, thousands of workers ensured she would not stay down. She was not preserved as a museum, which remains a source of regret for historians. Instead, she was scrapped in 1958, her hull cut apart, her steel recycled into new forms. But the legacy of what she represented, what all those rapidly repaired carriers represented, endured. That freedom, properly organized and directed toward a common purpose, generates a speed and power that rigid hierarchy can never match. That democracy's arguments are not weakness but strength, its flexibility not chaos but advantage. That abundance matters only if you know how to deploy it. And that America had learned to deploy its industrial might with a velocity that turned shipyard repair schedules into strategic weapons as devastating as any bomb or torpedo. The Japanese officers had been stunned by the speed of American carrier repairs. In their shock, they had glimpsed a larger truth about the nature of the nation they had challenged. A truth that no amount of careful calculation could have prepared them for, and no amount of courage could have overcome.